And of course, your first slide on what are services reminded us of the incredible reach, potentially, of this agreement. But international agreements, particularly agreements in areas that are sensitive, have to necessarily strike a balance between ambition in coverage and realism in scope. And of course, in services where the state has been so heavily involved in many sectors over time, even though we have witnessed over the last 2 decades a progressive withdrawal of the state as provider of services and a progressive alignment towards the state as a regulator. But the boundaries between state and market have been shifting throughout this exercise, of course, also introducing an element of rigidity, an element of precaution. And I think it's important when thinking about the incredible scope of coverage of the GATS never to forget that a number of services that are offered on a not-for-profit basis by the government, publicly delivered services, public services, which of course each WTO member will define based on its own collective preferences domestically, its own national equilibrium between state and market. That is a very important carve-out. But the language you will find in the GATS, the legal translation of this notion, is quite elastic. And a lot of people read Article 1.3 of the GATS and they say, well, what exactly is the meaning of this language? Because it does not define or does not identify specific sectors that are deemed to be public services. And the reason for that is very simple, because no two societies have the same collective preferences. No two societies have the same degree of comfort over what should be the proper domain of the state's intervention and what should be the proper domain of market competition. And so you will find very elastic definitions which the negotiators were keen to maintain in the scope of coverage of the GATS. The second point I would make, it relates to what Aditya just told us about the breakdown of services into 4 modes of supply. It's a very interesting paradox that in the early days of the GATS, developing countries who had fought against the inclusion of services on the Uruguay Round agenda and fought extremely hard against the introduction of investment as a standalone issue in the Uruguay Round, were highly reluctant to see the GATS negotiations actually constitute a sort of backdoor way of addressing investment in services. There was a lot of initial reluctance to actually consider Mode 3 as a form of trade in service. And so you had countries like India, Egypt, Yugoslavia, a lot of hardline countries at the time vehemently opposed to introducing Mode 3, considering that any international regime on services should deal only with cross-border trade, essentially the first 2 modes of supply. And yet as we went through the process of learning by doing, as we began to document the size of the flows, the importance of different modes, it became obvious that of course Mode 3 was by far the most important vehicle for trading services internationally, and it was also the mode of supply that allowed host governments the greatest ease of regulating the activities of foreign competition in their marketplace. And so paradoxically, at the end of the Uruguay Round and still today, Mode 3, commercial presence, remains the mode of supply against which we have seen the largest number of commitments, the greatest degree of relative comfort over the idea of liberalization. Interestingly, at the same time, as information technology has greatly increased the tradability of so many services, we see today in the Doha Round a great degree of interest of developing countries in seeing much more liberalization on Mode 1, a mode against which most countries in the Uruguay Round were not terribly comfortable in making commitments, because you cannot regulate what does not originate necessarily in your territory. But today India, who is fighting hardest to keep services out of the trading system, is probably the WTO member that is pushing hardest for the GATS to deliver a much more ambitious package of Mode 1 commitments, in addition, of course, to Mode 4, which was the natural counterpart of introducing commercial presence. India immediately, when commercial presence became an unavoidable mode of supply to be treated at the negotiating table, insisted, for reasons of symmetry in treatment between capital and labor, that we address, of course, the movement of people. So some very interesting historical evolutions of emphasis, and also a very contrasted set of level of commitments against these four modes. Aditya?
Coming back to the discussion that we had about the scope of services trade, I should say that this is the potential domain of the agreement. This doesn't really mean that the